Donna, exiled Kuwaiti nationals are spending this anniversary of their country's independence hoping for its speedy liberation. Kuwaitis who fled to Saudi Arabia after Iraq's invasion of their country spent the day in a mixture of celebration, mourning, and prayer. This Kuwaiti National Day marks 30 years of independence from Britain. Exiled Kuwaiti government leaders today thanked Allied forces for coming to the aid of Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion.
February the 25th is a day that has an impact on all Kuwaitis whenever they are. On this national day, the Kuwaiti people send the world a message of the Kuwaiti struggle inside and outside of Kuwait, and of their unwavering support for their legitimate government. Kuwait is small in a large world, but history will show how the entire world came to our side during our struggle to liberate Kuwait and help bring its legitimate government back.
Exiled Kuwaiti leaders say once their government is restored to power, most of the country's reconstruction contracts, and they will be considerable, will go to British and U.S. firms.
And that's it for this hour of our coverage. We're glad you could join us, and of course we continue next hour. I'm Donna Kelly.
I'm Bob Kane. Stay with us.
This is CNN.
Hello, I'm Bobby Batista in Atlanta. Our coverage of the war continues.
And I'm Reed Collins in Washington. President Bush has kept a low profile since addressing the nation about the beginning of the ground war Saturday evening, Washington time. Today, however, he described the news out of the Gulf as good. At a White House ceremony marking Black History Month, Mr. Bush prefaced his remarks with a brief comment about the war effort.
The liberation of Kuwait is on course and on schedule. We have the initiative. We intend to keep it. We must guard against euphoria. There are battles yet to come and casualties to be borne. But make no mistake, we will prevail. Kuwait will soon be free, and America's men and women in uniform will return home to the thanks and respect of a grateful nation.
The president says a successful ground campaign by the Allied coalition will pave the way for the new world order.
On this day 2 of the ground war in the Gulf, the Allies continue to carve a path to the gates of Kuwait City, and their commanders indicate Operation Desert Storm is running ahead of schedule.
Since the beginning of the ground offensive, coalition forces have destroyed more than 270 tanks and continue to attack all types of vehicles and other types of emplacements. And again, I would emphasize these are extremely conservative results. Since the beginning of the ground campaign, casualties remain extremely light. One casualty obviously is too many. As of this afternoon, initial reports indicate that 4 U.S. servicemen have been killed and 21 have been wounded in action.
Meanwhile, no pause in the air war. Allied commanders in Saudi Arabia say they have flown more than 3,000 missions in the past 24 hours, including some 1,300 missions over Kuwait and southern Iraq. They say 4 U.S. aircraft were lost during those missions. 3 of the 5 airmen on board reportedly rescued. On the ground, some 80 tanks from Iraq's renowned Republican Guard are said to be rumbling southward toward advancing Allied forces. The Allies' powerful push into Iraq reportedly included what they call the largest helicopter operation in military history. More than 2,000 men of the Army's 101st Airborne were airlifted more than 50 miles into Iraq yesterday. That included a U.S.-French operation that parachuted troops inside Kuwait City. In the Gulf, British officials say Iraq launched 2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles at Allied warships off Kuwait today. The British say 2 Sea Dart missiles fired from the destroyer HMS Gloucester intercepted one of the Chinese-made Silkworms. The other reportedly fell into the water. U.S. officials say the Allies have captured at least 18,000 Iraqi prisoners. The Saudis say 20,000. It is still unclear whether these include prisoners who were taken before the start of the ground offensive. One Iraqi prisoner was seen kissing his Saudi captor. And from the USS Nassau in the Gulf, pilots are flying reconnaissance missions over the Kuwaiti shoreline. They report Iraqi forces are holding their positions. There are also reports that mines in the Gulf are preventing a marine amphibious assault. British forces say they have destroyed 12 mines and located 5 others. CNN's Brian Jenkins is inside Kuwait and joins us on the phone now with an update from his vantage point. Brian?
Bobby, a brief light rain fell from the night sky over southern Kuwait a short time ago, and that will help hold down the dust kicked up by Allied battalions as they thunder toward Kuwait City. But it would take a downpour of epic proportions to wash away the damage we saw on the desert landscape today as we drove some 30 miles into the heart of Kuwait. We saw the burnt-out wrecks of Iraqi vehicles. We saw huge craters in the highway pavement, and debris spread here and there over the desert. We did not see any bodies lying in the desert, but it's likely that casualties were removed from the battlefield quickly as Allied forces rolled through. It's plain that Iraqis have surrendered in great numbers and in great haste. We saw at least 100 Iraqi prisoners brought up to a spot on the highway just half a mile south of where Iraqi artillery shells were thudding into the ground.
Brian, we appear to have lost our connection with CNN's Brian Jenkins inside Kuwait. We'll try to restore communications and talk with him again a little later. Reed?
As you heard, the operation launched what is called the biggest helicopter operation in military history. The Army's 101st Airborne lifted off on Sunday, and Jeremy Thompson filed this report early on in the operation.
The skies over Iraq are thick with helicopters. It's the largest airborne assault of its type ever mounted. By tonight, if all goes well, they'll have set up a huge forward base deep inside Iraq, a fortified fuel station for the helicopters, complete with field hospital and supplies. From this bridgehead, codenamed Cobra, 4,000 airborne troops will launch attacks into the Euphrates River Valley, south of Baghdad itself. The air assault, coupled with land attacks, is aimed at encircling and isolating Saddam's key units of the Republican Guard, now entrenched outside the southern Iraqi city of Basra. The first wave of 118 helicopters are now poised to try and cut off the Republican Guard from either retreat or advance. But as Allied armor moves forward in support, the latest intelligence suggests the Republican Guard are by no means finished. Coalition pilots have seen some 80 Iraqi tanks moving south across the battlefield towards the advancing front line of Desert Storm. The relentless artillery and air bombardment has clearly flushed Saddam's much-vaunted army from its bunkers. So far, the Allies have met only sporadic resistance. But if the Republican Guard have emerged from hiding for one last great stand, the battle ahead could be bloody and brutal. So far, though, the casualties have been far fewer than expected. During the night, the first American wounded were rushed back to a base hospital inside Saudi Arabia. Mines have posed one of the greatest dangers. This Marine caught shrapnel when his partner triggered a booby trap.
I thought I was dead.
Really?
Yeah, but it's like, it's like a hit right in the head right here. But a couple of seconds after that, I could hear voices and I was good to go.
Were you scared?
Yeah, a little bit. But I don't know, it's kind of weird. It's not what you expect.
And basically out of being a little bit sore and take your time. I think you're going to be just fine.
All right.
Okay?
The huge tented hospital is equipped to deal with any war injuries. The first patient, a Marine suffering from a gunshot wound, was soon on his way to the theater. His arm shattered by a high-velocity bullet as his troop overran an Iraqi position.
We squashed him real quick, but I got hit, and once I got hit, I went down. They got the coma to me, but like I said, the world didn't stop because I got hit, because we're Marines and we have to accomplish the mission first. And once the mission got accomplished and the area was secured, and I was taken care of.
Many of the staff are reserve volunteers, including one doctor well used to dealing with gunshot wounds after training in New York's tough Bronx district.
Over there.
Some of the injuries are similar, but then again, we must consider we're in a war situation where the weapons have high-velocity missiles, and they can do much more damage when entering the body. Although we see even in places like Bronx, they are starting to get some more high-velocity weapons there too. So, in these days, some of the war wounds are similar to those to the war in the Bronx.
Though the hospital staff are realistic enough to know they may not yet have seen the worst of war, as medevac helicopters ferry in more casualties from the front line. It's the scale of Iraqi prisoners that's most taken the Allies by surprise. Over 14,000 have been captured or surrendered in the first day of the land battle. Many of them, weary of war after weeks of bombing, have apparently lost the will to fight for Saddam's cause. Out in the Gulf, 17,000 Marines are still waiting to launch an amphibious assault. Their possible target is Failaka Island, which commands the approach to Kuwait City. It's heavily defended by 4,000 Iraqi troops, armed with Exocet and Silkworm missiles.
That report from ITN's Jeremy Thompson. CNN's Brian Jenkins is back on the phone with us now from inside Kuwait, where he is traveling with Allied forces as they move deeper into Kuwait. And Brian, you were telling us about the damage that you have encountered so far.
Yes, we saw a great deal of it as we moved some 30 miles up into the coastal region of Kuwait, and we also, as I was telling you, saw at least 100 prisoners brought up to a spot on the highway just half a mile south of where Iraqi artillery shells were hitting the ground and kicking up plumes of smoke. Those prisoners, mainly in their 20s and 30s, I have to say, were a tough-looking bunch. There's no way around that. But the expressions on their faces showed their hearts just weren't in fighting the mother of all battles that Saddam Hussein had called on them to wage. While the Iraqi POWs looked relieved and resigned, I have to report that the Saudi and Kuwaiti forces we encountered looked relieved and jubilant. It was a spectacular panorama for us to behold as we traveled north. Armored columns carrying Kuwaiti and Saudi Arabian troops on our right. They were smiling and waving and flashing us victory signs. And on our left, some of their comrades were kneeling in the sand just off the highway, bowing toward Mecca and saying their prayers, and saying thanks, I imagine, that Saddam's threat to make them swim in their blood so far has proved empty. Bobby?
Brian, when you say damage, are you also talking about enemy weapons and equipment?
We saw a number of Iraqi tanks blown apart on the edge of the highway. One appeared to have been completely engulfed in flames. We have to assume that the occupants either fled or were caught in the fire, but we, as I said earlier, did not see any bodies on the desert. If there were any, they had been removed, and we just don't know the extent of the casualties in the territory that we were able to cover. As far as the amount of equipment that the Iraqis left behind or had destroyed, it was not as much as I expected. We saw some tanks and trucks destroyed, but they were widely scattered and just not in huge numbers. I don't know if this means that many tanks were recovered in good condition and that equipment was taken away by the Saudis to the south, or if the Iraqis managed to take their equipment and hightail it to the north.
We were told before the war, Brian, we heard much about the fact that the Iraqi troops were heavily dug in, that they were surrounded by sand walls and trenches and barbed wire. Are you seeing evidences of this?
We saw a great deal of pipe laid across the highway and across the desert, but I don't know if this was irrigation pipe that was in place before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait last August, or if this was some kind of barrier that they put in. We didn't see a great deal of barbed wire in the section that we drove through. we did see thousands of mines poking up through the sand along the highway and out into the desert, and in several areas we were instructed to walk gingerly because those areas had not been swept for mines, and it was highly likely that we could step on one. So it will be a long, tedious job to detonate all those mines in the desert, and as we traveled through today, we could hear some of those explosions. We also heard offshore the huge roar of those big naval guns, those 16-inch guns on the U.S. battleships Missouri and Wisconsin. We don't know if one or both of those ships were in operation today, but we could certainly feel the reverberations from some 20 to 30 miles away, I assume.
Brian, we know that you can't say very much about where you are or where you are headed, but are you getting any word at all that Republican guards are headed your way or in your direction or in any other area near you?
They are some distance away from us. We are in the southeast quadrant of Kuwait, and we understand the Republican Guard were posted mainly to the northwest and perhaps had even pulled back into southern Kuwait before the Allied ground offensive began. The confident expressions on the faces of the Allied forces here, the Saudis and Kuwaitis primarily, would indicate to us that the Republican Guard would have a tough time advancing this far, and I would assume that when they come up out of their fortifications that it will be that much easier for Allied air forces to pick them off on the ground.
Well, let me ask you this then. What are the troops that you're with, which are Saudi troops, what are they anticipating when they get to where they are going? Or do you know where they are headed? Are they headed toward Kuwait City?
We asked one Saudi captain of an armored unit where he was headed. He clearly was moving north, and we asked him how long he expected it to be before he would reach Kuwait City. He shrugged his shoulders and smiled and said, oh, maybe 24 hours. He seemed very confident. We don't know if that's an indication that he was really planning to move forward. We have no idea what the military strategy is at this point and would not presume to predict what that will be. But there did seem to be a high degree of confidence among the Allied troops that we encountered today.
Would you say, Brian, that the Saudi troops are in danger of overestimating the ease of this effort?
Perhaps so, but I think we all were bracing for the worst. The threat seemed real. The Iraqis had 6 months to prepare their fortifications, and you asked me about that earlier. We did pass over an oiled trench, or a trench filled with oil. This was one of the barriers that we had heard so much about, but it just did not look as frightening in person as the graphics that we had all created for television had perhaps led us to think. I believe the American public, the Saudi public, and the other members of the coalition were probably preparing for the worst, but it looks as if the Allied forces were able to slice through the Iraqi defenses like the proverbial hot knife through butter.
One more question, Brian, about the POWs. Earlier in your report, you talked about a little bit about their condition and their morale. Were you able to tell at all whether or not they have been out in the field for weeks and were not getting supplies, or in other words, the condition of them perhaps nutritionally or anything like that?
They did not appear to be malnourished. They did not have sunken cheeks. They did not even appear as scruffy as I thought they might. But then again, these may be the second tier of troops, somewhat back from that front line, and perhaps their supplies were a little better than the Iraqis posted right on the border of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. They did seem, as I said, relieved. They were not smiling, but they did not seem to be cowering in shame or fear. I think they expected that they were going to be fed well and treated well. And as I say, I just didn't get the impression from looking at them that they had the stomach to go through with this battle to the bitter end, and perhaps they just didn't believe in the cause that they were asked to fight for.
All right, Brian, stay safe. CNN's Brian Jenkins reporting to us live from inside Kuwait. Reed?
And in a minute, we'll have a live report from the Pentagon as our coverage continues. To the Pentagon now, and a broader picture of the war. CNN's Gene Randall's there. Gene?
Reid, the Allied military briefings in Riyadh today all painted the same picture, one of sweeping coalition achievements against Iraqi forces, so far at very low cost. U.S. killed in action so far put at 4, 21 wounded. Among the costs to the Iraqis, more than 20,000 prisoners of war now held by Allied forces. Brigadier General Richard Neal said the only Iraqi success is terrorism in Kuwait.
Terrorism continues as the only Iraqi success to report to date. We have seen an increase in Iraqi terrorism throughout the KTO. As of 1300 this afternoon, we can confirm over 600 fires burning in the KTO. Of these, at least 517 are wellheads. Additionally, numerous facilities throughout Kuwait City are being systematically destroyed. Reports of atrocities of the worst sort are continuing to come in through reports.
General Neal characterized Iraqi resistance in the war as light to moderate. In the Saudi briefing, we heard increased resistance was predictable.
When you enter the first day, element of surprise has tremendous effort to make less resistance. Now we are talking about other more better trained forces, but as I said before, we have to plan for the worst. I believe that we might have more resistance today and tomorrow, but this is all planned for.
In the British briefing today, word of an Iraqi anti-ship missile attack. 2 Chinese-made Silkworm missiles were fired, possibly aimed at the U.S. battleship Missouri. The British Navy intercepted one missile, the other, Silkworm, apparently malfunctioned. It is clear what the Iraqis would like to do, inflict some kind of high-profile loss on the Allies. I understand we just have some pool tape arriving at CNN, and this is the 2nd Marine Division. We can't tell you much about this, including where the pictures were taken. The Marines, of course, are fully involved in this operation, although we have yet to see an amphibious landing. There is an amphibious landing unit in position. And even though that it has not been used yet, we are told it has the effect of psychologically affecting the Iraqis, in that they are not able to turn their backs on that Marine amphibious unit. Once again, this is pool video, which we have just gotten. The 2nd Marine Division. By the way, had word earlier today that a female helicopter pilot was flying combat missions in Iraq. We've had a clarification from the Army. It is a female pilot flying according to policy in a combat environment in Iraq, but we are told that the pilot in question is flying a Chinook helicopter, which is a supply aircraft. So technically, she is not flying combat missions, although she is clearly within a combat environment. Translation, the danger is there, male or female. It has been an enormous offensive punch delivered by the Allies, and yet we were told today in Riyadh only a fraction of what is available has actually been used. Clearly a warning to the Iraqis that if they intend to increase their resistance, there could be another 1-2 punch coming. That was an anti-tank gun mounted on the top of a Humvee, which is the newest military version of the Jeep. This video, once again, has just been gotten, and we thought it was important that we show you these pictures. Abandoned Iraqi positions here You'll not see as cleanly edited a piece of video as you might want to, but once again, this is pool video which we have just gotten. And once again, clearly a shot of an abandoned Iraqi positions. And we're told there are lots of scenes like this, that the frontline Iraqi forces apparently had no stomach for the battle. Hundreds of Iraqi tanks have been destroyed on the ground since the offensive began. The U.S. military also is reporting it has captured a number of Iraqi tanks, including some, not quite, but almost top-of-the-line Soviet-made T-62 tanks. And if you are just joining us, we should tell you that we don't have a lot of details to offer you on exactly what we are seeing, but this is pool video from the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations. Video cleared by the U.S. military. And when you see the abandoned Iraqi positions, it is probably easy to understand how there could be 20,000 Iraqi prisoners of war in only the second day of combat operations. In fact, large numbers of Iraqis, we're told, at times whole divisions of Iraqis gave themselves up to the advancing Allied forces. At this point, most of those Iraqi prisoners are in U.S. hands. Ultimately, they'll be turned over to the Saudi Arabian government, since Saudi Arabia is the host country for Operation Desert Storm. This appears to be a protected Iraqi position, protected by a sand berm. Protection apparently not enough to prevent the Iraqi forces inside or troops inside from abandoning it. 1,300 Allied air missions have been flown over the past 24 hours or so in the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations, and about 700 against Republican Guard positions. And part of the advance, of course, of the Allied offensive action is Kuwait City. One of the factors involving the planning has to be Kuwait City, in that there are charges from the Saudis and from the U.S. and from exiled Kuwaitis. There are reports of atrocities going on in Kuwait City that we're told will shock the world when pictures and other evidence are presented. The Saudi briefer this morning said the Allied forces will be in Kuwait City soon. He would not be specific, but clearly he gave an indication that there is some pressure to get there before any other kinds of atrocities can be committed there. Once again, pool video cleared by the U.S. military in day 2 of the ground offensive against Iraq in both Kuwait and Iraq. This, as you can readily tell, is unedited videotape. Although we should be thankful for the skill of the camera operator involved here. CNN, according to policy, has viewed this videotape before it was put to air. On the other hand, it is a very quick turnaround, so quick that we were not able to do any kind of editing. And again, we thought this was important to show. Fresh pictures from the war front. So the latest video we have from the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations. Reed?
All right, Gene Randall, live with us at the Pentagon, and our coverage will continue after this.
This is CNN.
Now updating some developments in the Gulf War. The latest pictures are coming out of Kuwait that show Allied forces on the ground. The U.S. 2nd Marine Division heading north. On its way, they pass burned-out tanks and Iraqi equipment. Testimony to the tremendous success Allied officials have described as against the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. artillery working as it moves north. And in the United States, there has been a prediction from President Bush, one that Kuwait soon will be free, that U.S. troops will return home to the gratitude of the nation. Speaking at a White House event today, he warned, though, against any excessive euphoria or optimism, explaining there are battles yet to come and casualties yet to be borne. But make no mistake, he said, the Allies will prevail.
Exactly.
Large numbers of Iraqi soldiers are surrendering to Allied forces. The United States has estimated now some 18 to 20,000. In fact, a Saudi official says the number is 20,000. The United States says that 270 Iraqi tanks have been destroyed, calling that figure extremely conservative. Among the tanks, some 35 Soviet-made T-72s, Iraq's most advanced model. As for casualties, the United States says 4 of its troops have been killed in action since the ground fighting began, and 21 have been wounded. The Saudis report 5 members of the Joint Arab Forces have been killed and 20 also wounded there. In the air, the United States staged 1,300 support missions over Kuwait, some of these targeting the large-scale Iraqi armored division reportedly moving south in the general direction of the northward moving Allies. 4 U.S. aircraft have been lost. As for the Republican Guard units moving south, others remain dug in southern Iraq. Allied troops, meanwhile, have been pushing northward, advancing toward Kuwait City. A Marine amphibious assault force remains offshore in the Persian Gulf, its exact mission undetermined as yet. A British report says Iraq has fired a Silkworm missile at a U.S. battleship Missouri. The British say, though, that a protective British destroyer shot down the Silkworm before it did any damage.
We have gotten reports in the last few minutes that air raid sirens had gone off once again in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We've also had a second report that Patriot missiles were fired, presumably to intercept Iraqi Scud missiles coming in, but we don't know that for sure, and we don't know if an interception actually took place. We don't even know at this point if Scud missiles were fired towards Saudi Arabia. We were also told that an all clear has sounded already, and that there was no air raid sirens going off in Riyadh, just in Bahrain. And that is all the information we have at this point.
U.S. Central Command says Allied forces faced off with Iraq's vaunted Soviet-built T-72 tanks today. U.S. armor, it is said, proved more than a match for the T-72s, and 35 of them were destroyed. CNN's David Bernkoff compares the 2 leading fighting machines.
The United States and Iraq have the world's 2 best tanks in their arsenals. For Iraq, the Soviet-built T-72. For the United States, the M1A1. The main gun on the T-72 is 125 millimeters. The M1A1's main gun is slightly smaller, 120 millimeters, but it fires shells over 6 miles. The Iraqi tank fires shells just under 6 miles, and it fires 6 shells a minute, compared to 12 shells a minute for the M1A1. The M1A1 is the faster tank. It can travel 41.5 miles per hour. The T-72 reaches a top speed of 37 miles per hour. With an extra fuel tank, its range is 435 miles. The U.S. tank has a range of 289 miles. The M1A1 can climb over obstacles 3.5 feet high, compared to the Iraqi tank's ability to climb obstacles just 2 3/4 feet high. Both Iraq and the United States have well-trained tank troops, but the Iraqis trained in battle during the long war with Iran. David Bernkoff, CNN reporting.
We gave you a lot of I don't knows or we don't knows a few minutes ago on that air raid siren, those sirens that were heard going off in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. So CNN's Carl Rochelle joins us now on the phone to provide further details for us. Carl? We are clearly having some audio difficulties with Carl's report. We can just barely hear him there in the background, so we'll try to reestablish that phone line in a few minutes.
It's not a favorite of the Air Force, but it's playing a role in the Gulf. The A-10, the Ugly Duckling. A special assignment report and the continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. Tonight, 6 Eastern on CNN.
All right, we've reestablished the phone line now to Saudi Arabia on CNN's Carl Rochelle with further information on the air raid sirens we heard going off a few moments ago. Carl?
Bobby, I think we have solved the problem with the audio, and yes, in fact, we did hear air raid sirens here in Saudi Arabia at this location just moments ago, and I did see at least one Patriot missile that was fired from near this location where you know there are Patriot missiles based that went downrange. We saw the glow as it disappeared. Now, 3 distinct explosions were heard, and usually there are 3 explosions with each one of these. One of the missile leaving, and another as it breaks the sound barrier going outbound, and the third on impact. I did not personally see the impact. I don't know of anyone who did, but we do know that the air raid alert sirens did go off. We were warned here a Patriot missile was fired, and there has been no damage from a Scud in this area. No Scud has hit anywhere within our sight and within our sound. We are all okay. Everything is just fine. We are holding right now. We have not been given the all clear sign yet, but one Patriot missile fired at a Scud apparently fired in our direction in eastern Saudi Arabia. Bobby?
All right, Carl, thank you. We'll get back to you when you have more information. Reed?
The Allied advance into Iraqi-held territory is being supported heavily in the air. Correspondent Mark Austin talked to some Royal Air Force pilots who get a unique perspective on the ground fighting.
The battle moves north, so do the RAF Jaguars. Spectacular departures from their Gulf base as they fly towards Iraq and Kuwait in support of ground forces. The skies over the battlefield are getting busy, and the RAF's Nimrod surveillance plane is watching it all. On board, the radar screens show the congestion in what the crew are calling the most dangerous airspace in the world.
The raid here has just gone to the south, that's Kuwait City, and the raid has gone possibly to the airport. Over here, we have some Allied ships. Over here, we have some more aircraft going in the raid. We're in the middle of it. However, we're well underneath. All these other aircraft are quite a bit higher than us, so there's no real problem there. Here we have another raid going in. There just seems to be a constant flow of aircraft in and out through southern Iraq and Kuwait.
The Jaguars will be on the Nimrod screens for days to come as they undertake sorties from dawn to dusk. The Jaguar pilots say they feel a part of the ground war, and the hope is that they'll soon be supporting their own ground forces, British planes helping British troops. Mark Austin, ITN, with the RAF in the Gulf.
I'm Donna Kelly at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
I'm Bob Kane. Day 2 of the ground war, and Allied commanders are reporting their words, tremendous success. Allied forces are steamrolling their way deeper into Kuwait with what is described as light to moderate resistance. Troops are advancing toward Kuwait City. The Iraqis continue to surrender by the thousands. But the fighting is far from over as the Allies close in on Kuwait City and the Iraqi Republican Guard positions. Here's how it's happening. With much of the Iraqi Republican Guard apparently still entrenched in northern Kuwait, more than 2,000 soldiers of the U.S. Army's 101st Army Airborne Division have now been airlifted more than 50 miles deep into Iraq. It is being called the largest helicopter operation in history. It is intended to establish a strong toehold west of Kuwait to cut Iraqi supply lines and to refuel U.S. helicopter forces. French forces are also pushing into Iraq, cutting off Iraqi forces in Kuwait. They are being joined by convoys of U.S. and British forces. Egyptian troops pushing into Kuwait have reportedly fired more than 1,200 tons of ammunition on Iraqi positions in the first day of the ground assault. Syrian and Saudi forces have also steamrolled across the border. And Saudi troops further east have joined U.S. Marine convoys plowing through Kuwait. Still more, Saudi and Marine forces have crossed the border on foot, closer to the coast. U.S. and French paratroopers are reported converging on Kuwait City. Earlier today, U.S. Brigadier General Richard Neal delivered a breakdown of the latest Allied successes.
Marine and Army forces have reported the capture of 20 T-62 tanks, 40 APCs, and over 400 EPWs. In another incident, 50 Tu-62 tanks are parked within 4 kilometers of their position, with the Iraqi crews indicating their desire to surrender. An additional 2,100 EPWs have been captured since I gave you those last numbers, and 20 to 30 tanks have been destroyed.
General Neal says terrorism remains, so far at least, the only Iraqi success, with the number of oil fires growing and civilian atrocities reported continuing in the streets of Kuwait City. Other reports continue to reach CNN from other usually reliable sources, saying Iraqi troops are committing atrocities inside occupied Kuwait. It is impossible so far to confirm those reports. Kuwaiti resistance says Iraqi troops have been ordered to firebomb and damage at least 180 specific buildings, including hospitals, medical clinics, schools, and postal facilities. That source also tells CNN the Iraqis are now targeting grocery stores, gasoline stations, and community social centers for damage and destruction. There's no independent confirmation of those reports. And finally, there was a Scud missile report, at least an alarm sounded throughout Saudi Arabia. CNN correspondent Carl Rochelle reports at least 1 Patriot missile fired. The all clear has been sounded now. No word on whether or where the Scud may have landed.
We have been getting some new pictures in that have been cleared by the U.S. military. We want to be joined by Bing West. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Colonel Sam Gardner. He's retired from the U.S. Air Force. Gentlemen, if you will assist us with your expertise here and help us describe these pictures that we're getting in.
Well, it seems to me that looking at these videos is clearly like looking at the war through a soda straw, but there's some important indications. What we're seeing here looks like a column that's advancing along 2 or 3 fronts. It seems to me that if these are Marine forces, what they're trying to do is follow one another to keep away from the possibility of running over mines.
This is the 2nd Marine Division.
And you can see in the distance artillery positions firing ahead of the troops. So we're probably, where these pictures are taken, or within 20 or 30 miles of the front.
But this is one-sided battle. You're not seeing any incoming. It's basically all outgoing fire.
All right, do we have any other pictures to see at this point?
In the earlier footage that we saw in the previous hour, there were some important things. I think if Iraq is watching this, it may be some of the best intelligence they're getting. It showed abandoned Iraqi artillery positions. That's a very important piece of intelligence that Baghdad ought to pay attention to. The troops.
Colonel Gardner, excuse me, as you say that, it occurs to me that we should mention here that all these pictures have been cleared by the U.S. military, that we're not giving away secrets as well.
That's right, but still, with the intelligence and the command and control system set up the way it is, Iraq's remaining command and control, this probably is the best they're going to see, and it's not a pretty picture for them.
But also notice the openness of the terrain. So the earlier reports today that some of the Iraqis were actually taking their tanks and moving out to do battle, you cannot expect those Iraqi tanks to get too far before they're taken under heavy fire by air as well as our land forces.
They're right there. Those are the abandoned positions. That's not a position that has been overrun. That's a position that has been abandoned by its occupants.
All right, and then we'll be getting a look at our next set of pictures, and this is smoke that's coming up from some of the oil fields that have been set on fire.
Well, that has long-term economic significance in terms of how Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the coalition are going to work out the post-war situation in terms of reparations. But on the battlefield, as you can see, it is not affecting the battlefield that much.
2 other things about these pictures. One of them is you can only move like this in the open if you have air superiority. Clear indication of the kinds of things that come from that. The second thing is the speed, I think, is important. They're not moving particularly fast for high-speed offensive operations. That suggests to me that we are, in fact, being very careful as we move forward.
But even at slow speed, Sam, since the battlefield is very small, it's only 40 or 50 miles from the jump-off point to Kuwait City, and it's only about 100 miles to where the Republican Guards are. You have to expect that as we're talking, even as we're talking, our battle positions are probably right outside Kuwait City, and most likely there is an engagement ongoing right now with the Republican Guards.
All right, let's go ahead to our next set of pictures. This will show medical evacuations.
Again, the first thing that strikes me compared to the combat that I saw in Vietnam with our Marine units there is that there's no incoming fire, that basically the entire battlefield, as Sam pointed out, is controlled by us. And so this is an evacuation, but it's not under fire. It's almost like an evacuation you could see even during a training exercise.
It's interesting. It's almost, one has watched these helicopters and that ambulance, there's a sense of gentleness about handling the casualties, which the permissiveness of the environment allows.
That's a good point. So far, these video confirm what General Neal was saying, that the operation is going extraordinarily well from the point of view of the coalition forces.
Interesting, Bing. Compare that to the pictures we've seen of Vietnam, with the soldiers running to the helicopters to get the comrades on board.
Well, that's what I meant, Sam. That in Vietnam, we always had to move as quickly as we could under situations like that before.
And even lifting off gently, being very careful with the casualties.
All right, some pictures we've seen before, but let's go back to the bunker VO.
Again, abandoned bunker. If Iraq is watching, this ought to be a very important picture for them. That's not an army that's defending.
That's right. It indicates that when they had a choice, they chose to flee.
There, however, is a bunker that looks like it was hit.
I'd say it is hit direct on.
What's that gentleman that we just went by? Did you have a chance to see that? It looks like a little cap at the top there.
I didn't see that, Donna.
Okay.
Here's another mortar position.
There's a mortar that they simply set up and then just left. This does not look like, this particular unit obviously did not want to fight. They wanted to get out of there as fast as they could.
The other thing, Bing, is those are well-prepared positions. You can see why a portion of the Iraqi army survived the air attacks. Those are well-prepared positions.
Yes, clearly they were deeply dug in, which also indicates that although air can do a lot, in the end, if you're in a battle such as this, you have to move in with the land forces. Air cannot do it all.
All right, let me ask both of you just one quick question to conclude here. There was talk this morning that things were going so well that the campaign would be accelerated. Do you see that happening? Colonel Gardner, you first, please.
Well, I don't think that the campaign has a schedule at this point. It has two objectives, as Bing and I have talked about. One of the objectives is Kuwait City. The other one, and the primary one at this point, is probably to get there and destroy the Republican Guard.
All right.
So basically, if you look at it on a map, here's one battle occurring out here. Here's the second battle occurring here. That's as much as we know that we've been told so far. And there's still this question of the amphibious force and where that will be used and when. And it appears that all the forces of Iraq down here have simply been cut off and bypassed. But we don't know. As was pointed out, it's almost like looking at something through a straw.
All right, Bing West, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Colonel Sam Gardner, retired U.S. Air Force. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Bob.
In a moment, a different view of the war through the eyes and ears of Baghdad. Official Iraq remains silent about the thousands of POWs the Allies report captured. But Baghdad radio is urging its soldiers to fight on to the death, claiming its troops are defeating coalition forces. Edward Sturton of Britain's Independent Television News has more from Baghdad.
Baghdad was this morning enveloped by what seemed to us a mixture of mist and smoke. It gave an eerie feel to a city that's been subjected to heavy bombardment for the past 24 hours. The raids continued throughout the small hours of the morning. We've counted at least 7 separate air raid warnings since midnight last night. And a new front has opened in Baghdad, the battle to control the flow of information about the war. In the lobby of the Al Rashid Hotel this morning, a group of officials from the Ministry of Information listened attentively to the latest Iraqi military communique. The claims of Iraqi successes were obligingly translated for us to report.
And Iraqis regained all positions that had been taken by the enemy.
Reports like that are of course aimed first and foremost at ordinary Iraqis, some of whom have been listening to the very different version of events they hear from British and American radio broadcasts. What about those reports that large numbers of Iraqi troops have surrendered? Do you believe those?
No, I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Questions about who's responsible for the war are sensitive. Some will express themselves forcefully.
I remember a saying of Winston Churchill when the British Air Force were fighting the Germans. He said that if the British Empire will live for 1,000 years, people will say this was their finest hour. If Sir Winston Churchill was alive, he would have said that this was their darkest hour.
Others are more reticent before the cameras. And what impact do you think it will have here at home if Iraq is defeated? What will it do to people?
Well, these are very critical, questions. I can't tell. Well, leave these things to the authorities concerned. Okay.
Okay. Just one final question. Whose fault do you think it was? Why do you think it came to this?
The same answer. The same answer.
The way the Iraqi people finally decide to answer those questions will have a profound impact on the political climate here once the war is over. Edward Sturton, ITN, Baghdad.
Fresh from the latest White House briefing, CNN's Mary Tillotson joins us. Mary?
The news for the Allies out of the Persian Gulf ground war, not quite 2 days old yet, is so encouraging that the Bush administration is talking about it in public. At least a temporary reversal of Defense Secretary Cheney's announcement Saturday evening when the fighting started that there would be a news blackout. President Bush today, for the first time, had public comment since the ground fighting started Saturday night. And the headline he delivered to people who visited the White House for a brief ceremony in recognition of Black History Month is that the news is good.
Enemy prisoners are surrendering in large numbers. And thus far, thank God, U.S. and coalition casualties are few. The liberation of Kuwait is on course and on schedule. We have the initiative. We intend to keep it. We must guard against euphoria. There are battles yet to come and casualties to be borne. But make no mistake, we will prevail.
Shortly after that brief speech, Mr. Bush, for the first time since the war started in the middle of January, called General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of Operation Desert Storm. According to White House spokesman Fitzwater, the call from President Bush to General Schwarzkopf was to both congratulate the general on the progress of the war so far and to thank him and the men under his command for the progress of the war. Asked whether there have been any surprises for President Bush in the way the fighting has progressed to this point, Fitzwater said the only surprises have been good surprises because the resistance was not as strong as the Allies had anticipated, and they're moving faster than expected. There were questions about whether the United States is now fighting in Iraq, whether there are plans contemplated to go into the city of Baghdad or perhaps Basra, which is the headquarters of the Republican Guard. Fitzwater dodged that one, saying only that the United States will do only what is required to carry out the UN resolutions. He didn't interpret what that meant. And the briefing, current daily briefing, as the plan at the White House has it, for Mr. Bush to get the very latest information out of the war zone is going on right now. His war advisors are in the White House with him, and perhaps we'll know a little bit more, an update after that meeting breaks up. Mary Tillotson, CNN Live at the White House.
Just ahead, CNN's Sonia Friedman with a look at the role of and the idea of women in combat. Air raid sirens sounded during the last hour in eastern Saudi Arabia. Witnesses say they heard an explosion and saw light flashes, apparently Patriot missiles intercepting the Scud, but there were no official reports of Patriot launches, nor any reports of damage or injuries. The Allies are using the word tremendous to describe the success they are achieving so far in the battle to liberate Kuwait. The 2nd U.S. Marine Division has moved into Kuwait, backed up by Chinook supply helicopters. One such Chinook helicopter is among those being flown on similar missions by a female pilot into Iraq. Marine Brigadier General Richard Neal says that coalition forces have engaged armor and mechanized units in Kuwait. There have been no reports of Iraq using chemical weapons. Military officials say they've met limited resistance from the Iraqi forces. They say the Iraqis' only success so far is on the terrorism front. Allied commanders report more than 20,000 Iraqi POWs rounded up since the start of the ground offensive. They confirm more than 270 Iraqi tanks destroyed in the first hours of the ground campaign, including 35 of the top-of-the-line Soviet T-72s. At least 1,300 U.S. air support missions have been flown to reinforce the ground assault. 4 U.S. aircraft reported lost in the effort. U.S. casualties reported so far in the ground offensive: 4 killed, 21 wounded. Iraq fired 2 Silkworm missiles into the Gulf today, apparently targeting Allied battleships in the Gulf. One Silkworm fell into the sea. The other was taken out by Sea Dart missiles fired by the HMS Gloucester, the British warship. At the Saudi military briefing today, the Joint Forces commander said the Iraqis are torturing, raping, and murdering Kuwaiti civilians. And he says those committing the atrocities would be held accountable.
We warn all who have taken part in the many crimes against innocent civilians in Kuwait, whether by rape, murdered, or tortured, that they will be held responsible before an international court of justice and will be treated as criminals of war.
Kuwaiti resistance sources say Iraqi troops have also been ordered to firebomb and damage 180 specific buildings, including hospitals, medical clinics, schools, and postal facilities. That source also told CNN the Iraqis are now targeting even grocery stores, gasoline stations, and community social centers for damage and destruction. There's no independent confirmation of those reports. Allied military forces are reported to be rolling over Iraqi positions on the second day of the massive ground campaign to liberate Kuwait. Pool tape shows U.S. Marines of the 2nd Division advancing northward inside Kuwait. U.S. military spokesman General Richard Neal said today, "We are meeting the enemy and beating the enemy." Neal said other Allied units have clashed with Iraq's elite Republican Guard units and that the Guards are being beaten. Pentagon officials say 35 of the Guard's Soviet-made T-72 tanks were destroyed in the battle in southern Iraq. Allied pilots also report massive quantities of Allied armor moving northward into Iraq. Iraqi prisoners are said so far to number close to 20,000. Officials say 4 U.S. soldiers and 5 other Allied soldiers have been killed so far in the day's ground fighting.
This is CNN.
In the face of defeated Iraqis, the Allies say the number of Iraqi prisoners of war is now around 20,000.
As U.S. Marines thrust deeper into Kuwait, U.S. officials are reporting tremendous success on day 2 of the ground war. This is CNN's continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. I'm Cheryl Atkinson.
And I'm Rolf Wendke. A U.S. military official says, and I quote, "We are meeting the enemy and beating the enemy." But the Allies say they're prepared for a stiffer fight as they press farther into enemy territory and as they face Iraq's more experienced soldiers. Now, here's some perspective on just what's happening on the ground in the war zone. In southern Iraq, near the Kuwait border, Iraq's elite Republican Guard remains dug in, though there is an unconfirmed report of a column of 80 Republican Guard tanks moving southward. Also inside Iraq, U.S. Army airborne troops poised to squeeze the Republican Guard. From Saudi Arabia, French forces are pushing north into Iraq. One general says the French have neutralized an entire enemy division. U.S. and British forces are also attacking Iraqi territory, while Egyptian forces are moving into Kuwait, along with Syrian and Saudi troops. Rounding out the thrust into occupied Kuwait, U.S. Marines, more Saudi forces, and other Arab allies. And there is a report from Pentagon sources of what they term a ferocious tank battle between Allied and Iraqi forces south of Kuwait City. And some U.S. and French forces reportedly have parachuted into Kuwait City. Joining us now live from Kuwait is CNN's Brian Jenkins. Brian? Brian?
Behind me, you can see for yourself some of the rubble left in this tiny Gulf state after more than 6 months of occupation and nearly 6 weeks of war. Today, we traveled about 30 miles north into the coastal region of Kuwait to survey the barren battlefield. We saw Iraqi tanks and Iraqi trucks, burned out shells scattered along the highway. We saw the caps of landmines, thousands of them poking up through the sand. We did not see any bodies out in the desert, but that is not necessarily an indication of casualties, it could be that the Iraqis either retreated hastily or surrendered hastily. We did see more than 100 Iraqi prisoners of war. They were gathered and brought to a spot on a highway. They were processed and questioned, herded into groups. They carried an expression of resignation and relief. They appeared to, in their eyes, not have it in their hearts to fight the mother of all battles that Saddam Hussein had asked them to wage. And after several hours, they were herded into buses and driven out to Point South in Saudi Arabia. We also saw, heading north, long columns of armored vehicles carrying Kuwaiti and Saudi troops. They smiled at us, they waved, and they flashed the victory sign. Today is Kuwait's Independence Day, and the Kuwaiti tanks, of course, were proudly displaying their country's colors, and one was also flying the Stars and Stripes of the United States. We wouldn't want to paint too rosy a picture based on what we saw today in this one territory in southeastern Kuwait. We know that there are reports that the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's elite force in the northwestern area of Kuwait and into the southern flank of Iraq, may be staging a counteroffensive at this time, and certainly those troops would carry more of a punch than those we saw today. But based on the expressions of confidence we heard from Saudi and Kuwaiti troops today, they believe that their forward march to Kuwait City will not be put in reverse. Reporting live from Kuwait, I'm Brian Jenkins.
Now, one of the big dangers, one of the worries that has confronted the Allied forces all along are the mines that we have learned have been planted throughout Iraq. Here you see the video that has been received of some of the mines that have been found. Some of these mines have been placed along the beachfront, some throughout the area where the Iraqis suspected that if any forces were going to come across the line from Saudi Arabia, for example, or from Kuwait into Iraq, those mines were placed. There had also been indications that the earlier reluctance of some of the Iraqi soldiers to give themselves up had to do with the fact that perhaps they knew those mines were there and they didn't want to get themselves into trouble either. So those mines are now being found, and some of them, as you see, being uncovered. Cheryl?
No regular briefing at the Pentagon today, but Pentagon officials have been talking informally off camera to reporters. Let's go live now to CNN's Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon. Wolf?
Cheryl, we've had some informal background briefings here at the Pentagon. Here are some of the highlights, things that we've learned. First of all, a unit of the Republican Guard did finally come out of its dug-in positions in southern Iraq, and U.S. officials say that about 35 of these Soviet-made T-72 tanks, the ones you're seeing right now, were destroyed. U.S. Air Force A-10s, the tank-killing aircraft, were brought in and presumably involved in destroying these 35 T-72 tanks. This incident occurred in southern Iraq along the border with Kuwait, the first major encounter between U.S. and Allied forces and the Republican Guard. There was a brief encounter on the first day of the ground war. Some secondary auxiliary units of the Republican Guard were involved in Kuwait. That was relatively brief. This is the first serious one, but Pentagon officials are cautioning that the real battles presumably have not yet occurred. They're bracing for more action in the ground war. There was a separate tank battle inside Kuwait, not involving the Republican Guard, but other Iraqi troops, and more Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed. At a briefing in Riyadh earlier today, U.S. Marine Corps General Richard Neal said that a total of 270 Iraqi tanks had been destroyed since the start of the ground war, and during the initial 37 or 38 days of the air war, over 1,600 Iraqi tanks were destroyed, according to Pentagon officials. Additional information that was released today: 2 more Iraqi planes managed to get off the ground today and fly to neighboring Iran. These are the first Iraqi aircraft to take off in over 2 weeks, according to Pentagon officials. There are now about 140 or 150 Iraqi planes that have flown to Iran since the start of the war. The Pentagon still has no information, no reports of any use of chemical weapons by the Iraqis, but this remains a fear, and U.S. and allied forces are prepared to deal with chemical weapons if, in fact, that does occur in the coming days. U.S. and allied forces continue to move not only into Kuwait, but in flanking operations to the west of Kuwait, deep into Iraq, and according to Pentagon officials, the troops have moved literally tens of miles into Iraq and Kuwait. No specific word on the location of where these troops are, but Pentagon officials continue to maintain that Iraqi forces will have no sanctuary in Iraq, that even if they're beyond the Kuwaiti border, they will be targeted in order to try to minimize U.S. and allied casualties. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney has been briefing the president and the cabinet over at the White House. Later this afternoon at 3:30 Eastern time, Cheney and General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, will be briefing here at the Pentagon the House and Senate leadership. At 5 o'clock Eastern time, the chairman and ranking Republican members of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittees will be coming over here for yet an additional briefing. These will be the first significant congressional briefing since the start of the ground war. Finally, one additional piece of information that CNN has learned, that in the course of these movements into Iraq and southern Kuwait, the U.S. and allied forces have managed to liberate some or take over some Iraqi air bases, and U.S. and allied aircraft are now using some of those Iraqi air bases as part of the ground offensive, this total land, sea, and air offensive. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
Wolf, thank you very much. We had this just in from the Associated Press. An Iraqi Scud missile apparently wrecked a building near Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, that's in eastern Saudi Arabia, housing U.S. soldiers. It set off a huge fire, and according to an eyewitness, many soldiers were injured. A freelance journalist at the site near Dhahran said there was a huge explosion, and then flames shot into the air. Reuters news service is now reporting that 12 were killed. We're presuming 12 servicemen. The freelance reporter said Saudi police removed many of the injured U.S. soldiers from the two-story building. It was apparently destroyed in that attack. A Scud missile hitting a building that housed U.S. soldiers tonight near Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Reuters wire service now saying that 12 people have been killed. As soon as we learn more, we'll pass it on to you. Cheryl?
When our war coverage continues, we'll take a look at the scene in Baghdad. Stay tuned.